Hello everyone! So it's time to finish off the top edge of Aurora's bodice. The zipper is now in and the final back seam is sewn up. So it's these edges here that need tidying up, so please keep watching if you want to see how I did it. I folded the raw edge inwards once and then again on itself to encase the raw edge. I smoothed out where the corset joins up with the purple layers as best as I could. And then I pinned this down into place. It's a lot of layers to pin through and quite bulky, so there is definitely some hand sewing to come after this. And after a while, it's all pinned, and now it's time to repeat all of those steps the exact same way to the other side. Then I took this to the machine and sewed as much as I could, making sure not to sew through the boning. So those pieces at the very end, I obviously didn't get around to sewing with the machine because there's boning in the way. I stopped machine sewing when I got to the boning and the bulky part, and again I just did this for the other side as well. Now that I machine sewed as much as I possibly could for the white corset layer, it's time to do the same for the purple dress layer. So starting where the zipper is, I trimmed the excess zipper sticking out to the top. So I chopped that off. To finish off this edge, I decided to use this bias binding tape stuff. So this is just some leftover bias binding that I used for my Jasmine costume. And it's a polyester bias binding, by the way. So I start by opening up one edge of the bias binding and lining this up against where my finished edge will be. Trimmed off the excess length that I don't need, just so it's easier to work with. I also cut away some of the excess purple fabric along the zipper that I didn't really need. This just gets rid of any bulk and makes sewing the bias binding to the top edge a little easier. So back to the bias binding, I'm laying it up against the raw edge. So open up one edge of the bias binding, align it to where the finished top edge will be, and then pin this into place. And then I took this to the sewing machine, sewed the bias binding down along the edge that's closest to the raw edge. I tried my best to sew on the fold of the bias binding, but it's okay if you're a little bit off. I mean, it's just going to be tucked under anyway and no one will see it, so yeah, just a nice way to finish off the edge. I sewed as close as I possibly could to the part where the corset is joined with the dress, as you can see here. Yep. And I also trimmed away excess seam allowance, mainly for the purple fabric, because that's where the majority of the bulk was coming from. The white bias binding is already quite thin, so I didn't feel the need to trim it. Now that's all trimmed, it's time to flip the bias binding so the right side is facing outwards. So flipping that to the inside, and then the right side of the purple fabric will be showing outwards. Yeah. And so you can see here that the bias binding is folded to the wrong side of the dress, and then I just pin this into place. I then sewed the bias binding down all along the top edge, and I tried to sew as close as possible to the actual finished edge of the fabric, and this is essentially top stitching, so this stitching will be seen from the outside of the dress, but because this is on the back of the dress, I don't really care that it's top stitched and that it can be seen. It's on the back of the dress, no one looks at that. So I'm repeating all of those steps for the other side. I'm just speeding this up so it's not as boring. But I also thought it would be good to include it anyway, just so we're not skipping steps. There is a lot of repetition in sewing, so I like to include all of the footage because it actually shows how much effort I put in. As for the part where the fabric folds over where the boning is, I just hand stitch these parts with some quick whip stitches. Nothing very neat, and I'm obviously not even using the right coloured thread. Yeah, whatever works. So I'm just hiding the knot under where the fabric folds over. Yeah, so hiding that knot, and then I'm just simply stitching along the line where the folded edge meets the corset, basically. And this will secure those flaps down. I did whip stitches on the other side as well, obviously. Along the very edge, I closed off everything with more whip stitches. So just stitch everywhere until it's all secure. I also decided to do some stitches along where the bias binding meets the seam allowance, close to where the zipper is, just to keep that intact and so it doesn't flap about. And this is what the finished edge looks like along the inside for the bias binding, and that is the outside. So you can see the visible top stitching along the top edge of the back from the outside, like I said. Yeah, not much else to it. And the idea is that the corset will lace up and then the purple layer will zip up over the top of the lacing. Just like that, except with a body inside it, of course. So you can see how the purple layer comes just above the white layer, just enough to hide it. Yeah, so that's all good. Now it's time to remove the basting thread from earlier. So all of these basting stitches, I just removed them by snipping them off. Yeah, they're not needed anymore now that the dress is all sewn together, so those chiffon layers won't be shifting anymore. Well, I hope they're not shifting anymore. Next, I decided to understitch all along the top edge because the white layer still kept wanting to poke through to the outside. So this was actually quite tricky to do. Yeah, so like flipping the corset to the outside and then trying to maneuver the corset under the machines in some way that I could do understitching. This was very difficult. So you can see here I've brought the whole corset to the sewing machine and like stuffed the whole thing under, which wasn't really working. Yeah, because the dress is just so massive. So I actually ended up attempting to understitch by having all of the skirt portion of the dress bunched up next to the sewing machine arm and then having the corset stick out towards the left. And then this way the boning could stick out as much as it needs to, so that just sticks out to the left side of the machine, and then all of the skirt I had to feed under the foot of the sewing machine, which was quite tricky, but I did it. So if you don't know what understitching is, it's basically stitching the seam allowance to the lining layer. And in this instance, the lining layer is the corset layer. So understitching helps to prevent the lining, i.e. the corset, from peeking out to the outside. And I just sew very close to the existing seam and also make sure not to sew through any boning. I actually just sew just above, just a smidge above the boning along the corset layer. So because of the bodice shape with the deep V in the front, I couldn't understitch that area. I just understitched as much as I possibly could go with the machine. So yeah, that's the understitching, or the attempt to understitch. It was very tricky, very tricky. Okay. So here is what the understitching looks like. You can see that it's only a couple of millimeters away from the existing seam, so very close. And oh, when checking my work, I actually had accidentally sewn into the actual dress fabric, so I just broke these threads apart with scissors. I had to be very careful not to cut into the chiffon, so just cutting the threads. Okay, Okay, here is a close-up of the understitching. You can see that I didn't bother to sew in the deep V part of the dress because that was just too hard to do by machine. And yeah, that's basically it for the understitching. Now it's time to flip the corset back into the dress like it should be. So inside the dress it goes, and that top edge is pretty much all finished. So now it's just a matter of, you know, maneuvering the dress and the corset inside the dress to make sure it all lays nice and flat. I don't know why I was having so much trouble doing this. It's not that difficult to just shove the corset into the inside of the dress. I don't know why it's so difficult. I made it look really difficult here. Okay, it's in and zipped up, there we go. Okay, so the corset is in. Yeah, and that's it. So the top edge of the bodice is all nicely finished now. I hope you enjoyed this video, and hopefully you found it interesting or useful. Make sure you subscribe and follow me on Instagram to see more progress videos and finished photos of this costume. Bye for now, and I'll catch you in next week's video.